Let's continue. There's a visual in the back, and here you have on your laptop. We move to the next topic, being the transferability of shares, and that is the last of the five core characteristics, and part of this table which maps all the topics of this course. And I repeat for all those who were not present in the last week, that when you have a storyline on each of the items of this table, then you're prepared to receive your credits for the current course. Yeah, that's the deal. Okay, and transferability of shares is basically a story of the classification of shares as pieces of property. And when you view the virtual certificates of ownership of a share as a piece of property, the first line of thinking around transferability of shares is that you can sell and purchase these pieces of property. Similar to the day-to-day reality that you can purchase chairs and can sell chairs, or coffee, or croissant, or whatever. So that is the first line of thinking in this topic. The second way is that there's a word called acquisition that is a sort of corporate law word when one firm is acquiring another firm. And you see that word in the name of departments of law firms and financial advisory firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers. That's then M&A, and the A is from acquisition, and the M is from merger, and that is what we will discuss. What's the difference? But in short, merger is that you fuse two legal persons so that it becomes one. And acquisition is that you purchase the shares of another company and organization-wise integrate it in your operation. Leave the legal person intact, but integrate it in your operation. And if you continue to do that, then you have the look and feel of your M&Es, your multinational enterprises, consisting of 200 plus legal persons. And from a business perspective, there is no difference between mergers or acquisitions. It's just an addition to your enterprise. But legally, there's a sort of crucial difference, and that is why it is a favorable topic to test whether you're able to express this sort of legal thinking, so a potential exam topic. So let's look into that more closely.
So on acquisition, then the legal person stays intact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then maybe more important than the legal nitty-gritty and comparing shares with shares is the keyword continuity. So when you look at it from a scholarly perspective, then maybe we should start with the keyword continuity, because, and I mentioned it earlier, but let's repeat that, if you can transfer ownership of the shares from one person to the other person, that means that legal persons could be regarded immortal, because the founder, which is a human being, can create a legal person, and when the founder dies, then his or her property, based on inheritance law, goes to the heirs, also known as children or whoever, and then they are the owner of that same shares, and then the legal person is not affected at all. That just the legal person continues to live. And that is a Well, beautiful feature, I would say, from the perspective of how do you arrange economic activities. And one angle could be that this is a perfect way to reduce transaction costs around economic activity. Because the idea that the legal person dies together with the owner would mean that you have to start all over again. And when you realize that a company like Unilever has its name on millions of contracts, starting all over again means that you have to redo all those million contracts. That takes you 3 years, you know? And who is selling soap in the meantime when you're busy with renewing the contract? And so in the economic concept of transaction costs, or the abstract idea of continuity, the fifth and last core characteristic of all those multinational enterprises we research is this continuity, so that they continue to exist. And that is an incentive to make them the best version of themselves, because they continue to exist for a long time. And that's symbolically included in the phrase transferability of shares. So two ways of looking at that, sort of down to earth. Well, share is a piece of property you can sell, a sort of boring approach, and the more integrative approach with words like immortality, continuity, lower transaction costs, and words like that. How then, from a legal perspective, is such a transfer of ownership realized? And the answer is, that is just contract law. The same topic as the last course with Michael Milo. I've overheard that his exam grades will be coming soon, isn't it? You're all looking forward to that. So, if you realize the actual transfer with help of contract law, then all those items of contract law apply. And let's simplify that in a sort of 4 stages. Let's call it a preliminary phase, where the buyer and the seller are sort of communicating with each other, sort of dance. Would it be a ID when I purchase your shares? And if so, how would that look like? And one of the keywords there is due diligence. That is an exercise where representatives of the buyer reviews the bits and pieces of the of the enterprise that is owned by the shareholder who is willing to sell the share. And due diligence is a keyword. Upcoming Thursday, that's most likely one of the things they will mention you will do as a starting professional. If you are in the M&A, the mergers and acquisition department. So I mentioned the law firms, I mentioned the PricewaterhouseCoopers, but let's not forget the investment banks who are heavily involved in the facilitating the sale and purchase of shares globally. And when you start in 15 months in a investment bank, one of the concrete things you do between 9 and 5 is doing a due diligence. What is the purpose of the preliminary phase? The purpose is to establish the purchase price of each share. How do you calculate the purchase price of the share? Well, you're economists, so the answer is the value of the whole company divided by the amount of shares is the price of the share. And or whatever a lunatic is willing to pay for the share. So on the stock markets or in this merger and acquisition world, there are hypes. So in the 17th century, there was a hype around black tulips. And in the early start of this century, there was a hype around dot-com companies. That was the first financial crisis when that hype exploded, and in 2008 there was sort of financial crisis where the assessment of the price of companies was not in line or way out of line with the real price. And currently, with companies like Uber and other unicorn firms, the funny reality is that the enterprise itself is not making any profit for 10 years in a row, but nevertheless, people are willing to pay a lot of money for the shares. So the value of a company is also expressed in future earnings. Either way, in the preliminary phase of contract law, you have to establish as buyer and seller what type of price range you would be regarding acceptable. And then you get hardcore contract law, offer and acceptance, as in that the seller says, I'm willing to sell it for this price. This as in the shares, one share, all the shares, depending how many you have. And that the buyer accepts the offer. So then jurists are sort of done, as in, all right, this is a contract. And then I identify a sort of fourth stage. I call that execution, because in all those jurisdictions, you need to take a few formal steps to actually move the ownership from one owner to the other. And the keyword is register. So the execution is that the transfer of ownership is registered in the shareholders register. And since shares are sort of sensitive things, and since we dislike financing of terrorism and money laundering, all those jurisdictions have increased the formalities for that execution. And in continental European countries, a civil notary is then involved. As with real estate, as a sort of agent of the state involved in actually putting the new name in the correct register in a set. So mergers and acquisition is a huge economic activity, and then when you look at it through the glasses of a legal professional, it's 4 stages with a sort of preliminary stage, because the identity and the features of a company is much more difficult to establish than a chair, because a company is a conglomerate of capital and labor and resources, or whatever language you use for that, and that is then called due diligence. So that is step 1. Here we have an example. So 100 years ago, there was one huge oil company in the United States, and then based on another topic called competition law, the state authorities ordered that that company was split up in different smaller companies, with the idea that that would curb monopolistic behavior. And then 80 years later, a few of those follow-up companies of the original ExxonMobil company merged again, or were with an M&A process put together to, in this example, the ExxonMobil company or enterprise. So the beauty of looking at corporate law from a historical perspective is that you see companies, they're broken up in parts, and then parts are fusing again to one company. And so it's sort of organic, as if we look at geology, where you have rocks, and then they erode, and then they are compressed again, and you have new rocks, sort of beautiful cycle in the identity, in our case, of companies. But you have chosen for the law minor, not of the geology minor. although that was an option, wasn't it? So that is just to give you some metaphorical insight. Let's look. So this was the end of the 5 core characteristics. Let's go to the interim topic of the agency problem, but in a very short manner, because we, in discussing the subsequent topics, so the real life, real case study type of issues, we each time mobilize the agency theory, but as such, in a sort of standalone version, it's rather dry and potentially complicated. So let's move through that in 5 minutes. So it's the chapter 2 of the table, and then the 1, 2, and 3. So not the 0. Those are the issues like how do you get a company and how do you do the categories of actions, but the key items described in the book. And then let's look at the various relationships. So we have the principal-agent problem in terms of shareholders, management, also known as board, as chief executive officers, as etc. 1 tier, 2 tier. Note, there is a principal-agent problem between the shareholders and the supervisory board, as an example. So the consequence of thinking in categories like principal-agent problems means that despite the soft talk I addressed before the break, there is a principal-agent problem between the shareholders and even the supervisory board. This slide we are looking at. 2, we have the majority-minority principal-agent problem, and here the best example are those mergers and acquisitions. Remember, the multinational enterprises we reviewed this course have no majority shareholdership larger than 11%, with the exception of Heineken. That means that in a merger and acquisition, there's no such thing that the 51% holder decides, let's sell. No. A coalition between 5%, 7%, 11%, 3%, they decide, let's sell Monsanto to Bayer. Or let's sell Dutch Royal Airlines to Air France. And that coalition, that majority, is then the principal, and the 0.1% shareholders are the minority. And due to legal nitty-gritties, if the majority decides to sell the company, then law says that the majority has to follow to avoid that individual shareholders can continue to be shareholder, where from an economic perspective it's better that all the decision, all the shareholder rights are in one hand after a merger and acquisition. And last but not least, we have the principal agent problem with the firm. Here the red colored rectangle pops in. So the conglomerate of the legal person, the assets, the organs taken together as the firm in relationship with the outside world, with words like creditors, so the suppliers, or society in a way with the externality. So that is the third version of the principal agent problem. Those are the 3 flavors. This means that now that agency problem thinking is part of the core of this course, you're invited each time, whenever you discuss actors, that you add, even when I'm not asking it, who is the principal, who is the agent? In a sub-sentence. So you have beautiful words on the design of the board of Unilever, and then on a separate paragraph or somewhere in the text you say, by the way, from the angle from the agency problem thinking, please be reminded that these and these guys are the principal and this organ is the agent. And that is part of how you could express your own thinking on a sort of intellectual level. Because if you just describe Unilever has a supervisory board, an executive board, and blah blah blah, and then that could be regarded as journalism for the Financial Times, which is also a decent job. But as a scholar or academically trained economist, if you use words like, whoa, but they are the principal and they are the agent, then you reveal the type of thinking belonging to at least students in a scholarly academic program on economics. And so I try to make it sort of concrete. And remember, also when people are not asking that, up to and including potentially job interviews, where they ask maybe, do you know something about the firm? And that you then mention, well, I know the name of the firm and who is in the board and etc. And then you read on some corporate social responsibility, tension stuffy, and then you say, oh, by the way, from a scholarly perspective, that is a nice example of the agency problem. Ding! Candidate thinks critically. Don't underestimate the need of recruiters to be confirmed that your brains are functioning. So disseminate, don't exaggerate, but when you have a chance, disseminate that you did some sort of serious reading and thinking. Don't wait until they ask, because maybe they will never ask and you will never land a sort of intellectual job. Okay. So that is the agency problem. And next week we will discuss regulatory strategies. How is the law trying to sort of solve the agency problem? And then we build on step one. Step one is there is such a thing as the concept of agency problem. And step two is we know in the reality who's the agent and who's the principal. Those are the first two steps. Step three is more complicated. How do we solve it? That's not so easy. And that can best be discussed while discussing the third chapter, being the regulatory strategy. Okay. That was the agency problem. On the map now. Chapter 2, mandatory reading. And let's move to the last topic of today. And that is in the table on the right side, the categories of real life problems. So the the fourth column, just for those who joined recently, the fourth column is about how do all these theories work out in the topics you actually experience in the economy and in your job. And today we choose the topic fundamental change or transaction because that illuminates quite a few of those core characteristics. So let's see how that illuminates that. And the first link is that this fundamental change is seen as label for such a share purchase transaction, a merger and acquisition. And that is seen as one of those fundamental changes in the sense that the legal person continues to exist, but that the ownership completely changes. So, yes, Dutch Royal Airlines in Dutch KLM exists. So when you go to Schiphol Airport, you see airplanes, but they are now part of a company called Air France KLM with headquarters in Paris. So the identity is fundamentally changed from the owner's perspective. Or in other words, it's a French company now. Fundamentally. And well, you can get a sort of feeling that could be regarded as fundamental. Then let's be more systematic and list what else counts as a fundamental change. And then the first item is the change in the articles of incorporation, the constitution of the legal person. We did not discuss that in detail, but when you deal with how do you establish a company, then we said, well, we have to create it, and let's add now, you create articles of incorporation. And in that articles of incorporation, there is a definition of the amount of shares. And if you want to increase the amount of shares, so you start with 1,000 shares, as Albert Heijn with one shop, but then you want to be a multinational operation enterprise with 1,000 supermarkets. Then you need finance, and one way of realizing finance is inviting new shareholders to join. But then you need shares, actual shares, digital shares, which then can be owned by those new fellow shareholders. And then you have to change the articles of incorporation, because the first edition says there are 1,000 shares, and then you need 1 million more. What does it mean when you start with 1,000 shares and you get 1 million more? Picture the shareholder meeting. First you are there with the three brothers of Heineken, of Albert Heijn, and then all of a sudden there are 600 other shareholders. That gives a fundamentally different dynamic. In technical terms, the majority of voting in the annual meeting with 1,000 shares is 501 shares, but with 1 million shares you need 500,001 shares to get a majority. So that counts as a fundamental change. Secondly, connected to that, when you state in the articles of incorporation that there are 1 million shares, then they are not yet issued. Issuing shares, second topic, is that you actually bring those shares to the stock market or to potential buyers or to a market. So in the articles of incorporation you define how many shares there are in theory, and then issuing shares, which is one of the business models of investment banks, to assist, facilitate the issuing of shares, then you actually bring those shares to the marketplace. Private market, public market, either way. And that's also a fundamental change, because then actually there are those real shareholders, not only potentially, but also real. Thirdly, the already mentioned merger and acquisition. And so we had Monsanto, you know, the seed company, and they merged with the German Bayer, which is a chemical product company. And that is a fundamental change, because not only the shareholders then change hands, or the shares change hands, but the organizational structure changes completely, and on the letterhead it says Monsanto, a Bayer company. So also in practical terms of stationery, you have to change everything. That counts as fundamental change. Well, and what are then the issues in the principal shareholder, principal agent perspective? The first issue is misappropriation of value. That in the course of the fundamental change, value leaks away. In which direction? To the agent. So if the management, the board, is in charge of the fundamental change, the risk is that they ask a too high price for their involvement in the fundamental change. And if value leaks to the agent, then it leaks away from the principal. So that's the first issue. The second issue is opportunism. Opportunism in the sense that the personal preferences of the agent, and the most telling agent is always the management, that personal interests of that management is blocking the economic-wise fundamental change. For instance, with the merger of Monsanto and Bayer, if the Monsanto board does not want, those are American board members, do not want to be subordinate to the German Bayer board, and then that personal preference could involve or influence the fundamental change, so that they obstruct the whole merger process. That's sort of harsh words, but that is basically the bottom line. Opportunism is that you not facilitate the fundamental change, but that you try to prevent it. And there are millions of ways to do that in a subtle way, and that is then the issue. And as of next week, we will look into the question, how could you prevent it? Remember, shareholders cannot talk and act on behalf of the legal person, only the board can. So that agent is endowed with all the rights and all the knowledge that you can possibly have around an enterprise. So labeling that as a issue is not a hypothetical thingy, that's sort of real life threat, because those shareholders living on the Fuji Islands, they don't know that much about, Monsanto and Bayer, because that's all delegated to the management. So in the whole basic structure of enterprises, there's a lot of room for those misappropriation of value issue, and for that reason, concern of scholars. Then on page 146, there's a interesting name for that misappropriation of value, and that name is tunneling. And now that we commemorate 30 years after the breaking down of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, you could hopefully appreciate the word tunneling, because tunneling was the actual digging of a tunnel underneath a Berlin Wall to escape the non-capitalist East and come to the paradise of the West. And that word is used by scholars to describe what the agent is doing when they are cheating on the principal. They metaphorically create a tunnel with which they leave the ship. So that is the story of the word tunneling.
But then to merge with someone else or what?
Well, to merge with someone else indeed, or to get a higher fee for themselves, or to not have the merge and acquisition take place in the first place, so that they just continue in the old way. People hate change, so better to leave everything the same. So those types of stories. I wish to close this topic with three pictures. And that is, oh, it's working again. Amazing that they can do that on a distance. Oh. There are three methods to do this merchant acquisition as one of the fundamental changes. And we have the ingredients: shareholders, legal person, the board, and the firm. So the rectangle, the red rectangle, sort of this sum of the board, the organ, the legal person, and the contract. And the three methods are cash, stock, and portfolio. And these drawings are intended to help your understanding of the theme mergers and acquisition. First, we have method A, that you have the company B on the right and company A on the left. Mergers and acquisition is normally an activity of one firm towards other firms. So this is the main method. The company B, so the legal person, speaking through the mouth of the board, is talking to the shareholders of company A. And they offer to buy the shares. Then you have offer and acceptance. And then in the execution, the shares of company A are put on the name of company B. Company B has a board. Company A has a board. Company B owns the shares, so another chair. And then in their capacity as shareholder of company A, they can appoint and dismiss the board of company A. This is one. And for instance, with the example of KLM and Air France, here you see a version of that story. So this is the main flavor. Then you have two sort of variations. The first variation is that the shareholders, the sellers, are not receiving cash, but that they receive other shares. So the same offer, but not that shareholder A receives cash on the bank account, but they receive shares of company B, which have a value. This flavor is used when the shareholders wants to continue to be involved in the company as a minority participant. And below you see that, similar to the version A, also here the company A is then the property of company B. That is to say that all the shares, or the majority of the shares of company A, are owned by company B. And then the third method is, and I call that the portfolio method. The shareholders of company B owns company B. And they decide, I like owning companies. Let's buy another separate company. And then the shareholders, so not the company, but the shareholders decide to purchase the shares of A. And then the end of the story is that shareholders have two companies. And this is done by those investment firms who have electricity companies and toilet paper companies and airlines. And so they have a portfolio of companies. And those companies are independent, not integrated phenomena, enterprises, because one is flying around and the other is producing toilet paper, and so there's no incentive to put them together to create synergy. So when you read in the newspaper or in the exam instruction, there's a merger of acquisition, first of all, in your brain, identify which of the flavors. Is this flavor A? So where you feel that company B is sort of integrating A in their sort of group of companies activities. So this is what happened with all your M&Es. And an integration can come in different forms. Take for instance the Volkswagen Group. They own different trademarks. Volkswagen, Audi, Seat, Skoda, Bugatti, stuff like that. So when you are participating in the traffic, you see different cars, but the synergy is that the wheels and the steers and the electronics and the engines, that they are the same. And that is why people say a Skoda is a Volkswagen. Because internally, they're composed of elements produced in one of the other plants. Economists call that synergy, efficiency. But you have also, for instance, with the example of Air France KLM, that they try to create a new brand. So on the how do you say that? Those memberships cards as a passenger, there's the name Air France KLM on the new cards. So they try to sell the new identity, whereas the planes are still separately branded. And a middle way is what you quite often see, for instance with Calvé peanut butter, that on the etiquette it says a Unilever company. Or with certain toilet paper that it says a Johnson & Johnson company. And so different ways to disseminate the end result of a combination. And then the difference between A and B is cash and shares. And a synonym for shares is stock. And the reason that sellers do not dislike stock as payment method is that no one wants cash, because cash is minus 1% on the bank account, and stock could increase in value. So who wants cash? Yes, students want cash, but investors tend to appreciate other types of assets rather than cash, because there's much more potential in growth of value. Second emotional reason, when you establish company A as shareholder, you dislike the idea that you do not have anything to do with it anymore, because company A was your life. So many startups who are purchased by the M&Es, including Apple and Microsoft, they purchase those startups and then integrate the human being called shareholder as employee in the bigger conglomerate, because they have knowledge. So they are not only shareholder, but also worker in their own company. That is how the whole phenomena of startups play in this drawing of the method of mergers and acquisitions. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move to the workshop.